My name is Miriam Okafor-Wells. I am 51 years old. I want to tell you how it ended before I tell you how it began, because the ending is the specific thing that made the beginning finally make sense to me. 18 months ago, on a Thursday afternoon in October, I was sitting in the offices of the Georgia Secretary of State's Charitable Solicitation Compliance Division, in a building on Trinity Avenue in Atlanta, across a desk from an investigator named Sandra Cho, who had been auditing charitable organizations in the state of Georgia for 19 years. We had been in that office for 2 hours and 40 minutes. On the desk between us was a banker's box containing 14 months of financial records, board meeting minutes, vendor contracts, donation receipts, bank statements, and a specific set of documents that Sandra Cho had pulled from the state's own charitable registration database. She closed a folder. She placed her pen on the desk beside the folder. She looked at me with the specific expression of someone who has been doing this work for 19 years and who has just confirmed something she had suspected for the preceding 6 weeks of her investigation. She said, "Ms. Okafor-Wells, I want to tell you something before we conclude today." I said, "Please." She said, "In 19 years of charitable compliance work in this state, I have seen a great many financial improprieties in nonprofit organizations. Most of them share a specific characteristic, which is that they are discovered through the specific attention of an insider who noticed something was wrong and who maintained the documentation that made the investigation possible." She said, "Your documentation is the most comprehensive I have encountered in a case of this nature. The records you maintained would have been excellent before any question arose. In the context of what we found, they are extraordinary." I said, "My grandmother was an accountant." She said, "She taught you well." She said, "I want you to understand that the findings of this investigation are going to be significant and that there will be a referral to the Attorney General's office for further action. I also want you to understand something about your role in all of this." I said, "All right." She said, "The financial improprieties we've confirmed across the past 14 months total approximately $203,000. The specific mechanisms used were varied and in some cases sophisticated. The documentation you maintained, particularly the parallel financial tracking you developed, and the specific records of transactions that did not appear in the official organizational accounts, is the specific evidence that made this investigation possible." She said, "Without what you brought us, this would have been substantially more difficult to establish, and the specific person responsible would in all probability have continued the pattern until the organization either dissolved or someone with less patience than you brought it to our attention through other channels." She paused. She said, "I want to ask you one question before you go." I said, "Yes." She said, "How long did you know?" I thought about the specific question for a moment. I said, "I suspected from the 8th month. I confirmed my suspicion in the 14th month. I brought it to your office in the 15th month." She said, "You suspected for 14 months and continued building the documentation rather than coming to us." I said, "I came to you when the documentation was complete enough to be useful." She looked at me. She said, "That is a very specific kind of patience." I said, "My grandmother called it bearing witness accurately. She wrote something in the folder." I said, "She also called it knowing when you have enough." Before I tell you who embezzled $203,000 from a charity we built together from the beginning, and how she did it in front of 400 people and called it a fundraiser, let me take you back to the beginning. Because the beginning is where I first understood what kind of person Diane Hollis was, and what kind of person I was, and what the space between those two things was eventually going to require. I grew up in Stone Mountain, Georgia, the older of 2 daughters born to James and Cecilia Okafor, who had come from Nigeria in 1972 and who had built their American lives in the specific way of Nigerian immigrant families of their generation in the Atlanta metro area, organized around professional achievement and community standing, and the particular form of faith that expresses itself in sustained daily action rather than periodic declaration. My father was a civil engineer who spent 32 years with the Georgia Department of Transportation, building bridges and highways and the specific infrastructure of a growing metropolitan area, with the quiet satisfaction of someone who understood that their work was literally holding things together. My mother was a retired high school mathematics teacher who had spent 27 years teaching at Stone Mountain High, and who had, in those 27 years, the particular impact of a teacher who understands that the subject she teaches is not primarily about the subject, but about what the subject teaches students about how to think precisely. My grandmother, my mother's mother, was Margaret Adeyemi, who had been a bookkeeper for 40 years in Lagos before she came to Atlanta in 1988 to be near her daughter after my grandfather died. She lived with us for the last 11 years of her life, in the specific room at the back of the house that had been mine before Amara was born, and that had become Grandma Margaret's room from the summer I was 14. She was a small, deliberate woman with the specific quality of someone who had spent 40 years handling other people's money, and who had developed through that handling an absolute refusal to accept imprecision in any financial matter, regardless of scale. She is the specific reason I am sitting here telling you this story, though she died when I was 25 and had no way of knowing what her particular obsession with accurate record-keeping would eventually make possible. She taught me bookkeeping when I was 12, not because she thought I needed to know bookkeeping specifically, but because she believed that understanding how money moved through a system was a fundamental life skill that her granddaughter was going to need, and she was the person available to teach it. She sat with me at the kitchen table every Saturday morning from when I was 12 to when I left for college at 18, going through the specific mechanics of double-entry accounting and bank reconciliation, and the particular art of maintaining records that were simultaneously complete and legible. She said once when I was 15 and complaining about the Saturday sessions, "The person who keeps the accurate record has the truth. The person without the record has only their memory, and memory bends toward what people need it to say." I remembered this when I was 26 and working for a foundation in Atlanta, and discovered that a colleague was filing expense reports for meals that had not occurred. I remembered it when I was 31, and noticed that a vendor invoice at the nonprofit where I worked had been processed twice. I remembered it each time something in a financial system I occupied did not quite add up, because Grandma Margaret had taught me that accurate record-keeping was not a personality trait, but a discipline, and disciplines applied consistently produce specific outcomes. I remembered it, most importantly, on a Sunday evening in July, approximately 8 months after the founding of Bright Path Forward, when I sat at my home office desk and compared the organization's official QuickBooks record to the parallel spreadsheet I had been maintaining since the beginning and found a discrepancy of $11,240. I need to tell you about Bright Path Forward before I tell you about the discrepancy, because understanding what the organization was is necessary to understanding what the embezzlement cost, which was more than money. I founded Bright Path Forward in the spring of what I will call year one of this story, with a woman named Diane Hollis who had been my colleague for 7 years at 2 different Atlanta nonprofits, and who was, by any reasonable external assessment, an excellent fundraiser and a genuinely passionate advocate for the cause around which we built the organization. The cause was educational support for first-generation college students in the Atlanta metropolitan area. Students who were the first in their families to attend college, who were often navigating the specific complexity of higher education without the particular institutional knowledge that families with college experience carry naturally, who needed not only financial support, but the specific mentorship and guidance and bureaucratic navigation assistance that Bright Path Forward was designed to provide. I want to say clearly, this cause was and is genuinely important. The students we served were real, and their needs were real, and the work we did for them across the years of the organization's operation was genuinely meaningful. I want to say this before anything else because I think the cause deserves to be separated from what happened with the money, and because the students who were served by the organization had nothing to do with what I am about to describe. Diane and I had met 7 years earlier at the Community Foundation of Greater Atlanta, where she was Director of Development and I was Program Director. She was good at what she did. Genuinely good. She had the specific warmth and the specific organizational intelligence that fundraising requires in its best practitioners, the ability to make donors feel that their giving was meaningful and specific rather than transactional, and the ability to maintain relationships with those donors across years in ways that produce sustained giving rather than one-time gifts. She also had, and I came to understand this more fully across the years of our partnership, than I had in the 7 years of working alongside her as colleagues at other organizations. A specific relationship to money that I want to describe accurately, rather than with the retrospective simplification that it is easy to apply after you know how something ends. Diane understood money as a resource whose primary significance was what it enabled, not what it represented. This is not unusual among fundraisers. What was more specific to Diane was that the boundary between what the money enabled for the organization and what the money enabled for Diane was not a boundary she maintained with particular rigor. She was not ostentatiously materialistic in any visible way. She did not drive an expensive car or wear expensive jewelry or otherwise display the specific signals of someone spending more than their income explained. She had a specific and largely invisible relationship to the money she moved through the organizations where she worked, which is the specific kind of relationship that is easiest to maintain and most difficult to detect. I did not understand this about her when we founded Bright Path Forward. I understood it gradually, across the months of the organization's first year, through the specific mechanism of Grandma Margaret's discipline. We opened Bright Path Forward's bank account at Citizens Trust Bank in Atlanta in April of year 1. The initial capitalization was $35,000, which had been raised through a soft launch fundraising effort over the preceding 6 months from a combination of individual donors who knew Diane and me from our previous nonprofit work and 2 small foundation grants that we had applied for and received. I set up the accounting system. QuickBooks, the standard software for small nonprofits, configured for nonprofit chart of accounts with appropriate fund accounting. Diane was listed as an authorized user on both the bank account and the QuickBooks system, as was appropriate for a co-founder and co-executive director of an equal partnership. I also, from the first week, maintained a parallel spreadsheet. I want to explain this decision specifically because it was the specific decision that made everything that followed possible. I maintained a parallel spreadsheet not because I suspected Diane of anything in particular. I maintained it because Grandma Margaret had spent 40 years teaching me that accurate parallel records were the standard practice of careful bookkeeping, that the check against the official account was not a sign of distrust, but a fundamental control mechanism, and that organizations where one person had both access to the official accounts and no parallel control were organizations where discrepancies, whether accidental or intentional, were harder to detect. The parallel spreadsheet tracked every deposit and withdrawal I personally authorized or was present for. It tracked every vendor payment I knew about, every donation receipt I received directly, every reimbursement I approved. It was, in effect, my own independent record of the financial activity of the organization, maintained in parallel to the official QuickBooks record. At the end of every month, I reconciled the parallel spreadsheet against the QuickBooks record and against the bank statements. The first 7 months were clean. Every number matched. The reconciliation was routine and quick, and I moved through it without concern, which was the appropriate response to 7 months of clean reconciliation. The 8th month was when I found the discrepancy. $11,240. In a nonprofit organization with an annual budget of approximately $280,000 in its second year of operation, $11,000 is a significant amount. It is approximately 4% of the annual budget, which is above the threshold that auditing standards consider material. I want to describe exactly what I found, because the description is the specific detail that matters. The QuickBooks record showed a payment to a vendor called Atlanta Event Specialists, LLC, dated a Tuesday in late June, for $11,240. The payment was categorized as event production costs for our annual benefit dinner, which was scheduled for October of year 2. My parallel spreadsheet did not have this payment. I had a record of our event production discussions through July, because I had been part of those discussions. The vendor we had agreed to use was a company called Premier Events Group, not Atlanta Event Specialists. The contract with Premier Events Group was in the organizational files, and I had reviewed it. The amount in the contract was $9,800, not $11,240. I spent 40 minutes on that Sunday evening comparing the two records, and then I opened the bank statements, the direct statements from Citizens Trust that I downloaded monthly as part of my reconciliation process. The bank statement showed the payment, $11,240, paid to Atlanta Event Specialists, LLC, on the Tuesday in June that matched the QuickBooks record. I searched the organizational files for a contract with Atlanta Event Specialists, LLC. There was no such contract. I searched the Board of Directors meeting minutes for a motion authorizing a payment to Atlanta Event Specialists, LLC, or any discussion of changing vendors from Premier Events Group. There was no such discussion. I went to the Georgia Secretary of State's Business Search Database and searched for Atlanta Event Specialists, LLC. The registration for Atlanta Event Specialists, LLC, had been filed 4 months earlier. The registered agent was listed as Diane Christine Hollis. I sat at my desk for a long time after I found the Secretary of State registration. Then I opened a new folder on my computer. I labeled it Documentation. I copied everything I had found into it, and I dated the folder with that specific Sunday, and I began building the specific record that Sandra Cho would tell me, 14 months later, was the most comprehensive documentation she had encountered in a case of this nature. I want to tell you what I found across the 14 months of the documentation period, because the specific nature of what I found matters to understanding the full scope of what Diane had done. The $11,240 paid to Atlanta Event Specialists, LLC, in June of year 2 was not the first irregularity. It was the first one I identified through the parallel reconciliation. When I went back through the preceding 7 months of records, with the specific attention of someone now looking for a pattern, rather than simply reconciling numbers, I found 3 earlier payments that I had not noted at the time because they had appeared in the QuickBooks record with vendor names that were legitimate vendors we did use, and the amounts were not dramatically inconsistent with what those vendors charged. I found, going back through 7 months of records with the Secretary of State database open alongside the vendor records, that the payments to 2 of those vendors had been made to slightly different entities than the contracts showed. Not dramatically different. The kind of difference you might attribute to a clerical error if you were not specifically looking for the pattern. A vendor listed in the contract as Premier Audio Visual Services paid as Premier AV Services, LLC, a vendor listed as Atlanta Catering Cowboys paid as Atlanta Catering Company, LLC. Both Premier AV Services, LLC, and Atlanta Catering Company, LLC, were registered with the Secretary of State with Diane Christine Hollis as the registered agent. Diane had created a series of shell companies. She had created contracts with legitimate vendors, negotiated actual services, and then diverted the payments to her own entities rather than to the actual vendors, paying the actual vendors from personal funds or from other organizational accounts in amounts that were lower than what she had recorded, and pocketing the difference. It was, as Sandra Cho would eventually tell me, a sophisticated mechanism. The actual services were provided, so the events happened as planned, and the donors and beneficiaries saw nothing wrong. The amounts diverted on any single transaction were not dramatic enough to produce immediate concern. The shell companies had legitimate-sounding names. The QuickBooks records would have passed a cursory examination because the payments were to named vendors for plausible amounts for services that were actually provided. What they would not pass was a reconciliation against the Secretary of State database and the actual vendor contracts. I built that reconciliation across 14 months, month by month, transaction by transaction, vendor by vendor. By the 14th month, I had identified 37 transactions totaling approximately $184,000 in payments to Diane's shell companies, in addition to the $11,240 in the initial discovery. I also discovered a second mechanism in the 9th month, one that was less sophisticated but no less harmful. The annual benefit dinner was the organization's primary fundraising event. In year 1, it had raised approximately $92,000 from ticket sales, table purchases, and auction items. In year 2, we were expecting to raise approximately $120,000 based on the expanded invitation list and the specific commitments we had received from major donors. I organized the event, the logistics, the venue, the catering, the program, the auction, the registration system. Diane managed the donor relationships and the solicitation. 407 people attended the Year 2 benefit dinner on an October evening at a venue in Buckhead that we had contracted with Premier Events Group to provide. The dinner was, by any reasonable assessment, a success. The room was beautiful. The food was excellent. The program was moving and specific, and the students who spoke about the impact of Bright Path Forward support produced the particular emotional response in a room of donors that produces significant giving. The official total raised at the Year 2 benefit dinner, as recorded in the QuickBooks system and as reported to the Board of Directors at the post-event debrief, was $98,400. My parallel records showed a different number. I had been at the registration table for the first 45 minutes of the event, helping check in arriving guests. I had a record of every table purchase and every individual ticket sold, because I had managed the ticketing system and had the back-end access to the registration platform that showed total receipts. The registration platform showed total receipts of $117,200. The QuickBooks record showed $98,400. The difference was $18,800. I had the registration platform records. I had printed screenshots of the back end at the close of registration and had kept them, the specific habit of someone who has learned that contemporaneous documentation is more valuable than memory. I looked at the cash donations collected during the event, which were handled separately through a collection process that Diane managed at the event itself. The cash collection went through Diane's hands before it was counted and deposited. I could not account for the cash collection mechanism precisely, because I had not been the one handling it. What I could account for was the discrepancy between the registration platform total and the QuickBooks total, and the registration platform total was a system-generated report that could not be altered without administrative access to the platform that only I possessed. $18,800. In front of 407 people, at an event the organization had publicly promoted as a fundraiser for first-generation college students, approximately $18,800 had not been deposited into the organization's account. Let me stop here for a moment because I want to ask you something directly. Have you ever been building a record of something while the thing was still happening, knowing what the record was eventually going to show, but not yet having the record complete enough to do what needed to be done with it, and have you sat with the particular patience of someone who knows the truth, but has not yet finished documenting the truth? Drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is there. Because what I did when I reached the point where the record was complete is the specific thing I want you to understand before I describe the outcome. If you have not subscribed yet, please do. I brought the documentation to 3 people before I brought it to the Secretary of State's office. The first was my attorney, a woman named Patricia Coleman who had been my personal attorney for 12 years and who specialized in employment and nonprofit law. I brought her the complete documentation folder on a Tuesday morning in the 15th month, the morning after I finished the final reconciliation and confirmed that the total I had documented was accurate. She reviewed everything that morning while I waited. Not skimming, reading. The same specific, careful attention she brought to everything she reviewed. She said, "Miriam, this is comprehensive. I said, I know. She said, you've been building this for 14 months. I said, yes. She said, while you were still working with her. I said, yes. She said, while she was still doing it. I said, the documentation required the pattern to continue. Stopping it prematurely would have meant that what I had was incomplete. She looked at me. She said, that's the most specific thing I've heard you say in 12 years of knowing you. She said, what do you want to do? I said, I want to report to the Attorney General's Charitable Solicitation Division. I want the organization's financial records to be examined by a state authority whose findings will be a matter of public record. I want what Diane did to be documented by someone other than me through a process that is formal and official, and that produces a conclusion that is not subject to challenge as the personal grievance of a co-founder. She said, you understand this is going to result in significant investigation of the organization, not just of Diane. I said, I understand. She said, you understand your own financial involvement in the organization will be examined. I said, I have 14 months of parallel records showing every transaction I personally authorized or knew about. I welcome the examination. She said, you have thought about this. I said, for 14 months. She said, all right. She said, I want to review one more time. Then I'm going to call Sandra Cho. The second person I brought the documentation to was the board chair of Bright Path Forward, a man named Robert Pittman who had joined the board in year 1 and who had the specific quality of a board chair who took his fiduciary responsibilities seriously rather than treating the role as an honorary position. I called Robert on the Tuesday afternoon after the morning meeting with Patricia. I told him what I had found. I told him the specific total. I told him about the shell companies and the registration platform discrepancy. He was quiet for a long time. He said, Miriam, are you safe? I said, yes. Why? He said, because you're telling me you've been sitting on this for 14 months while working alongside the person who was doing it. I want to make sure you're all right. I said, I'm all right. The documentation is complete. He said, you should have told me sooner. I said, I needed the documentation to be complete before I told anyone. Telling anyone with incomplete documentation would have allowed Diane to characterize this as a co-founder dispute and would have given her time to destroy records or create alternative explanations. He said, you protected the record by protecting the source. I said, yes. He said, Miriam, what do you need from me right now? I said, I need you to convene an emergency board meeting for Thursday. I need the board to know before the Secretary of State's investigation begins, because they are going to be contacted as part of the investigation, and I want them to hear from me before they hear from anyone else. He said, Thursday. What else? I said, I need you to have your own attorney present, and I need Diane not to be told about the meeting. He said, I'll take care of it. He did. The third person was Sandra Cho, whom I met for the first time on the Thursday morning of the week after the board meeting in the offices of the Secretary of State's Charitable Solicitation Compliance Division on Trinity Avenue. I brought the banker's box. Sandra Cho spent the first 15 minutes of our meeting looking at what I had brought. Not skimming, reading. The same specific attention that Patricia had given it. She said, Ms. Okafor-Wells, can you walk me through how you organize this? I said, yes. She said, start from the beginning. I said, my grandmother was a bookkeeper for 40 years, and she taught me that accurate parallel records were the fundamental control mechanism for any financial system, and that the person who maintains accurate parallel records has the truth when the official record is wrong. She looked up from the folder. She said, your grandmother taught you this. I said, when I was 12, every Saturday morning until I left for college. She put down the folder. She said, tell me everything. The investigation ran for 6 weeks. Sandra Cho's team examined every record in the banker's box and requested additional records from the organization's bank, from the QuickBooks vendor, and from the Georgia Secretary of State's business registration database. They confirmed the shell company registrations, they confirmed the payment discrepancies, they confirmed the registration platform total against the QuickBooks record for the benefit dinner. The investigation's findings were issued in a formal report in November of Year 3. The report identified 37 transactions totaling $184,230 in payments to entities registered to Diane Christine Hollis, and documented the $18,800 discrepancy between the benefit dinner registration platform total and the amount deposited in the organizational account. The total misappropriation documented in the report was $203,030. The report was referred to the Office of the Attorney General for further action. Diane was arrested in December. She was charged with theft by taking financial transaction card fraud and several counts related to the false vendor filings. Her attorney entered a not guilty plea. She eventually entered a negotiated plea. I was not party to the plea negotiation, and I was not told the specific terms before they were finalized. What I know is the public record, which shows a conviction on 2 counts of theft by taking, and a sentence that included restitution and a period of supervised probation. I am not going to describe how I felt about the arrest or the conviction in the specific way of someone performing a feeling for an audience. I felt multiple things simultaneously, and most of them are private and belong to the specific complicated relationship between what Bright Path Forward was supposed to be and what Diane had done to it. What I will tell you is one specific thing I felt, the feeling that I want to describe because it is the most useful part of this story. When Sandra Cho told me that the documentation I had maintained was the most comprehensive she had encountered in a case of this nature, I felt the specific particular feeling of someone receiving confirmation that something she had done was not only right, but adequate to the purpose it was built for. Adequate is the word I want. Not spectacular, not beyond expectation. Adequate to the purpose, which means exactly sufficient to accomplish what it was supposed to accomplish. My grandmother built her 40-year career on adequate record keeping, not showy or over-engineered, accurate and complete and organized and maintained consistently. The Saturday morning sessions at the kitchen table, the double-entry principles, the bank reconciliation process, the specific discipline of checking the record against the record, had produced across 40 years of her practice and my lifetime the understanding that adequate and consistent was more valuable than elaborate and intermittent. The documentation was adequate. That is what I felt. The specific satisfaction of adequate. Bright Path Forward did not close. I want to say this clearly because I think the organization's continuation is part of the ending that deserves to be told. The board made the decision to continue operations in December, 2 months after the Secretary of State report, and while the criminal case against Diane was still in its early stages. The decision was made with full knowledge of the financial loss, which represented approximately 70% of the funds raised in the first 2 years of the organization's operation. It was the right decision. The students who had been accepted into the program were in the middle of their academic years. The commitments we had made to them were real, and we did not break them. The foundations that had funded us were contacted directly before the criminal case was public and given a complete accounting of what had happened and what we were doing about it. Most of them continued their support. 2 increased their grants specifically to help the organization address the financial gap. I became the sole executive director. The co-executive structure, which had always been a concession to the reality of a partnership rather than an ideal organizational design, ended with the partnership. I hired a bookkeeper, a professional with credentials who had no relationship to any of the organization's principals and whose job included maintaining the independent financial records that the volunteer parallel process had previously served. I also hired an accounting firm to conduct an annual audit, beginning in year 3. The organization is in its 5th year of operation now. We serve 43 students currently. We have raised enough in the 4 years since the investigation to replace what was lost, not quickly, through the specific sustained patient work of rebuilding donor trust through transparent practices and documented outcomes. I think about Grandma Margaret sometimes when I am reviewing the monthly reconciliation reports from the bookkeeper, when the numbers all match and the reconciliation is clean, and the record accurately reflects what happened in the organization's finances in the preceding month. She died at 81. She had been bookkeeping until she was 79. She kept records of everything, and she never lost a single client because of an accounting error. I think she would have found this story specific. I want to tell you about the conversation I had with Robert Pittman on the night the verdict was entered in Diane's case, because it is the conversation that closed this story for me in the specific way that some stories need to be closed. We were at a restaurant in Buckhead, Robert and his wife Carolyn, and me and my husband Daniel, the specific dinner that people have when something significant has concluded, and the conclusion deserves marking without being made into more than it is. We had dinner. We talked about things that were not the case for most of the meal, which is what you do when you have spent 2 years in the middle of something significant, and you have arrived at its conclusion, and you are still learning how to be in the space after the middle. At the end of dinner, Robert said, "Miriam, I want to ask you something I've been wanting to ask for a long time." I said, "Go ahead." He said, "In the 14 months you were building the documentation, when did you know you had enough?" I said, "The 15th month." He said, "How did you know?" I said, "My grandmother used to say she knew when the account balanced. Not when the numbers looked about right, when they balanced exactly." He said, "And they balanced in the 15th month?" I said, "Yes." He said, "What would you have done if they hadn't balanced in the 15th month?" I said, "I would have continued until they did." He said, "What if it had taken 2 years? 3?" I said, "I would have continued." He said, "You're a very patient woman." I looked at my husband, who was smiling in the specific way he smiles when he is hearing something that he knows from living with me, and that is being described to someone else for the first time. I said, "My grandmother called it bearing witness accurately. She said the most important thing anyone could do when something wrong was happening was to be the person who saw it clearly and recorded it honestly and held the record until the record could speak." He said, "She sounds like a remarkable woman." I said, "She was a bookkeeper for 40 years. She would have said the remarkable part was just the discipline." He said, "And you?" I thought about 407 people in a ballroom in Buckhead on an October evening, raising money they believed was going to first-generation college students, money that was partly going into Diane Hollis's shell companies. I thought about 43 students who are in our program right now, because the organization they are depending on did not close. I thought about Grandma Margaret at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning when I was 13, going through a bank reconciliation for the 4th time because there was a $14 discrepancy, and she was going to find it. She found it. A transposition error. 2 numbers reversed. $14, not missing, but recorded in the wrong place. She said, "This is why we do it exactly, not approximately. Exactly." I told Robert this story. He said, "And the $14? I said, "She corrected the transposition and the account balanced." He said, "And now?" I said, "And now the account balances." He raised his glass. I raised mine. Here is what 2 years of building a parallel spreadsheet and 11 Saturday mornings at a kitchen table and 40 years of my grandmother's discipline taught me. I know that accurate record keeping is not a personality trait or a professional specialty or a quirk of people who are particularly organized. It is a fundamental discipline that anyone who manages money on behalf of others, or who is in a financial relationship with someone who manages money, owes to the purpose they are serving. The students of Bright Path Forward deserved the specific protection that accurate record-keeping provides. I owed them that protection, and I gave it, and the giving of it was what made it possible to confirm what was happening to their money and to stop it. I know that the parallel record, the independent verification of the official account, is not a sign of distrust. It is the specific mechanism of accurate accountability. Any official account unchecked against a parallel record is an account that can be wrong without the wrongness being detected. Diane's scheme worked for as long as it did because no one had thought it necessary to maintain a parallel record. It stopped when the parallel record was complete enough to be presented to an authority that could act on it. I know that the patience of 14 months, the specific patience of continuing to document while the harm was ongoing, because the documentation required the pattern to continue, was not possible. It was the specific active choice of someone who understood that incomplete documentation would produce an incomplete investigation and an incomplete result. The patience was the work, and I know that my grandmother, who never knew about Bright Path Forward and who never knew Diane Hollis and who spent 40 years doing bookkeeping in Lagos and 10 years doing it quietly in Atlanta for the specific families she helped manage their accounts, left me the most valuable thing anyone has ever given me, which was not money and not property, but the particular discipline of knowing how to see what is actually happening with money and to record it accurately and to hold the record until the record is ready to be heard. She called it bearing witness accurately. That is the most specific description of what I did across 14 months, and it is the most specific description of what the 40 years she spent in her practice taught me. The account balances. That is my story. A parallel spreadsheet maintained for 14 months, a banker's box on a desk in Trinity Avenue, a grandmother at a kitchen table on Saturday mornings, and 43 students who are in a program tonight because the record was kept accurately enough to protect what it was built to protect. If this reminded you of something you bore witness to accurately, something you saw clearly and recorded honestly and held until the record could speak, I want to hear from you. Drop it in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to know that the discipline of accurate record keeping is not a small thing. It is the specific form of protection available to everyone who has access to the truth and the patience to document it. Hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.